OSHA's HAZWOPER standard is composed of several different sections covering important topics related to HAZWOPER safety and training requirements. Major sections include site safety and health, site characterization and control, required training, medical surveillance, engineering controls and work practices, monitoring, and decontamination. We'll only be discussing a brief overview of each of these sections. Seek out additional training to dive deeper on each subject as needed. Under HAZWOPER, employers are required to create and implement a Site Safety and Health Plan, or HAZIP, for each hazardous waste location that covers all employees who will be involved with hazardous waste operations. According to OSHA, the plan has two main goals. The first goal is to identify, evaluate, and control safety and health hazards. The second goal is to provide for emergency response for all operations involving hazardous waste. The plan must be kept on-site and readily available. It also must be updated as needed when and if job tasks change. If emergency response procedures are handled by local personnel, required elements for the plan include a risk and hazard analysis for each job task, employee training assignments, required PPE, medical surveillance and monitoring requirements, site control measures, decontamination procedures, how to handle spills, and an emergency response plan. Each of these elements is also its own section within the HAZWOPER standard. If emergency response is to be handled by an outside vendor, their information must be provided in the section of the HAZIP. Site characterization is a preliminary evaluation of specific hazards and risks on site completed before workers enter a site. Hazards include anything at all, not only hazardous waste, that could cause serious harm or even death. Once workers enter the site, a more detailed evaluation to characterize the hazards and risks is required. Updates to engineering controls, work practices, and PPE may also be necessary. Questions that need to be answered during these evaluations include: how will workers be protected? And what engineering controls and level of PPE is needed? Site control is a plan that's developed to protect workers from hazardous waste cleanup operation. This is created during the planning stages. Elements that should be included within this plan include a site map, including an evacuation plan muster point, standard operating procedure or SOPs in place, how to communicate an emergency, and where medical assistance will be located if needed. Workers' health must be monitored to look for signs and symptoms of medical conditions that could cause harm. This is required to be provided at no cost to the employee. All employees who are exposed to hazardous substances above the permissible exposure limit, or PEL, and those who wear a respirator for more than 30 days a year are covered. Additionally, hazardous material team members or hazmat team members and anyone that becomes ill or injured are covered. Examinations should be completed before entering the site, at least once a year, and at the end of employment. They can be more frequent on an as-needed basis. Physicians are required to be informed of the job tasks, PPE used, and expected exposure levels. Records must be kept. What hazards are being monitored, how often, and what equipment is being used? Monitoring needs to occur whenever exposure to a hazardous substance might exceed published PELs. It's imperative that proper engineering controls, work practices, and PPE are in use at all times. How often and the type of monitoring required varies. The air must be monitored on initial entry to determine what and how much of the hazardous substance is present in the air. Periodic monitoring should also occur when PEL is exceeded, a flammable environment develops, or if an immediately dangerous to life or health (IDLH) condition occurs. Periodic monitoring is often completed when a new type of job task begins or an unexpected spill occurs during cleanup. All high-risk employees, those with the highest exposure, should always be monitored no matter what. All hazards must be controlled using the hierarchy of controls. This hierarchy helps to determine the actions necessary to best control worker exposure. Engineering controls help to isolate workers from hazards and reduce exposure. These include using protective barriers, ventilation, and modified equipment. Often engineering controls are not enough. Safe work practices must always be followed, and PPE is a requirement, not an option. SDSs and other literature serve as a guide in determining what protocols should be in place. PPE plays an essential role in protecting workers exposed to hazardous substances and keeping them safe. PPE is chosen based on the site characterization, evaluation, PELs, and the specific job tasks being completed. Total body hazmat suits should be used when skin absorption of the hazardous substance may cause death or serious injury. Respirators should be used when exposure levels could cause death or serious injury. The level of protection may need to increase or decrease as site conditions change. No matter what though, some level of PPE should be worn at all times while on site. After being exposed to hazardous substances, you and your PPE will need to be decontaminated. The HAZWOPER standard requires that all employers have a decontamination plan in place before anyone enters the contaminated site. There should be SOPs in place to minimize the exposure to others not working on site, and methods chosen that will best remove the contaminants. Usually, this is completed down what is called a decon line, in an organized and very specific sequence, in the order of decreasing contamination. Decontamination methods must be monitored for effectiveness. Changes to the plan should be made as needed. Treatment, storage, and disposal facilities are required to follow all requirements for both HAZWOPER and HAZCOM. This means they're required to have plans for safety and health, medical surveillance, decontamination, new technology, training, material handling, etc., etc. Their training requirements are a little different. Only 24 hours initially, and then the 8-hour refresher course once a year. The very last section of the HAZWOPER standard is devoted to explaining, in detail, employer requirements for developing and implementing an emergency response plan. Emergency response plans must be kept on site and easily available and accessible to employees. They apply for all emergency response operations regardless of where the hazardous substance emergency takes place. The plan's required to include several key elements. These include the chain of command and worker responsibilities in case of an emergency, how to recognize an emergency, and how and where to evacuate if there is one. In addition, the plan must include site security control information, emergency decontamination protocols, and emergency medical treatment procedures. If emergency cleanup is delegated to an outside vendor, their information should be found in this section. Training is also required. Employees must be trained in advance so they know what to do. The training they receive should be based on their role if and when an emergency occurs. Just like all HAZWOPER training, refresher training is required once a year. PPE requirements may differ in an emergency than a normal cleanup operation. Employees must know how to select the correct PPE for different emergency scenarios. Finally, this plan must include post-emergency response procedures outlining next steps. There are a few additional sections found within the HAZWOPER standard which we've not addressed. These include handling drums and containers, new technology and informational programs, and illumination and sanitation requirements. As a reminder, this training is only meant to provide an overview of the HAZWOPER standard. Additional training may be required.